Welcome, bienvenue, ahlan wa sahlan, bonjour. Thank you for joining us today. My name is David. I'll be moderating today on behalf of the Canadian Boat to Gaza, a member of the Freedom Flotilla Coalition, sailing against the blockade of Gaza for almost 10 years now, a blockade which has lasted almost 14 years. We're coming to you today, I'm speaking to you today from the traditional lands of Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Huron, Wendat, Arawandra Neutral, Munsee, Delaware, Lenape peoples. And the streaming is actually coming to you from unceded coastal Salish territory, the city of Vancouver. And we keep in mind that when we're talking about colonialism and decolonialization elsewhere, we also have to decolonialize our relations with the original peoples of the places we live, wherever we are. We're really happy to be talking to you today about a not very happy issue, but happy because we've got a great panel to talk about with it. We have LIA TARACHANSKY, REHAB NAZZAL, Dimitri Lascaris, and Michael Link, who will introduce as they come up. But we'd like to begin, first of all, with a little bit of a video that LIA TARACHANSKY, the Russian-Israeli-Canadian journalist, shot about 8 years ago for a film project. And after we see some of this street conversation, we'll be talking to LIA about the significance of those conversations. So if we have the video queued up, we can hear from video in a minute. Just so you know, as the intro video or intro slide said, we have a Q&A thing, a Q&A tab open. You can write your questions in there and we'll get to them in due course. We're planning a question and answer section at the end after we hear from our panelists. If the video is ready, we'll hear from Street Conversations and then go to LIA.
אם אתה לא יודע מאיפה אתה מגיע, אתה לא יודע לאן אתה הולך. אז אתה לא יודע מה היה כאן בהיסטוריה. אתה לא יכול להבין מה קורה כאן עכשיו, ולמה כל מה שקורה קורה.
בבנקים שהם פשוט מציפים את הבנק. אני לא חושבת שיש מדינה אחרת בעולם שתיתן על נתינים שהם לא מהמגזר שלה כאילו כל כך הרבה מה שנותנים להם. קודם כל צריך למצוא להם טריטוריה אחרת, ואז להראות להם שהם מסוגלים גם להיות עצמאיים ושהם יוכלו ככה להיות עם הריבונות שלהם ועם
בוודאי שזה חשוב היום, מה זאת אומרת? העבר שלך זה מה שבעצם ממצב את העתיד שלך.
Thank you, Leah, for that footage from 8 years ago, I guess. You shot it for a film project. Its significance then, from 2012, referring to events of 1948. For the people who are speaking, but its relevance also for us in Canada today. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think, as a Canadian and an Israeli, I am really always shocked at the level of parallels that exist between the two settler colonial societies and the level of the way that certain kinds of narratives get embedded and how they get manifested within the settler colonial society. So that clip was a clip for a film that exists. It's called On the Side of the Road. It was back then, it had the working title of 7 Deadly Myths, but it got changed to On the Side of the Road. And you can watch that feature film on narrativeproductions.com. I decided in the end not to include that clip in the film because there was more powerful manifestations of that. But I think that for me, when I'm trying to understand that, and I'm currently doing a PhD on this, there's the colonial gaze, which is developed over the course of when colonialism becomes settler colonialism and evolves and changes its motivations and its relationship to the indigenous population. So what I see in that clip and what I see in those conversations is, first of all, obviously an ignorance about any facts or history that's not settler history. In that moment where I ask how many Palestinians, and the person thinks I'm asking him how many Palestinians died in 1948. First of all, there's no way that he would know, because in Israel, the 1% statistic of Israeli soldiers dying in that war has been so embedded into so much of our education about 1948. And the absence of the mortality on the other side is invisible until you start to see that there's a colonial relationship, and then those questions become obvious questions. And so there's that ignorance, there's the lack of seeing the idea that, and when I push him further and I say, not how many died, I'm asking you how many lived. And the idea that Palestinians lived and thrived and had society and have a society, a complex society, and that has all kinds of things going on in it. Just like indigenous people here have had a history and have a history and a society, and so many things are happening here, and how ignorant we are as settlers to their history and all the things that they have done and all the things that have led them to the decisions that they've taken. Just people looking at people as equals, that is broken in the colonial gaze. The other elements of the colonial gaze that really came through is the idea that it's a very settler colonial idea that when the settler wants to indigenize themselves in order to stake claim over the land, and in Israel, obviously that's very profound, but here in Canada it's just as strong, except it's always delivered with a much more veneer of politeness. But this idea that, yeah, maybe somebody lived here, but we are the ones that really built this place, and we are the ones that have really contributed to civilization here, and we are the ones who brought all these great things, indigenizing the settler. And another element of the colonial gaze that was very evident, of course, is the kind of surface level, which I think a lot of pro-Palestinian activists are very aware of, the surface level of the racism and the negative stereotypes, which is what really kind of striking when you are new to these kinds of dynamics of just like, oh yeah, they just they don't know how to behave. They flood the banks. They do these things. They are violent. They are, whatever is the negative stereotype that the person attaches themselves to in order to somehow justify the supremacy of settler colonialism. And finally, the last piece of the colonial gaze is the paternalistic attitude of like, what the girl was saying at the end, which is like, if I don't know if they can live on their own. I don't know if we stop, propping up their regimes. I don't know if they could have independence and sovereignty because, the idea behind that kind of stereotype is that somehow we are assisting Palestinians in bettering themselves. And if we stop with our colonialism, then somehow they're going to fall apart. And, that paternalistic relationship that Canada has also towards its Indigenous people manifests primarily through the existence of the Indian Act. To me, it's the one that really drives me the most to rage. So now that I'm doing this analysis in my scholarly work, I'm looking at the pieces I was making in the past, and all of my work, it's related to 1948, it's related to colonialism, or it's related to today's manifestation of the processes that started 150 years ago and earlier to some extent. So I'm looking at these parallels, and it's really striking to see that now that we are talking about annexation, a recent poll in the Israeli news was showing, because right now there's the coronavirus and the way that the Israeli government has dealt with it in the beginning quite well, and then horrendously. There is the lack of social network, social net for people who are struggling. So, the privatization of the Israeli socialist economy from the 80s until now has led to the total destruction of social security. So, 1 million people are directly affected in incredibly devastating ways. There's the 4 investigations and court cases of the prime minister and the corruption behind that. There's the threat of another election around the corner. And inside of all of this mess, Netanyahu announces annexation in an attempt to distract the population from his failure to form a government, his failure to prove his failure to postpone the court cases against him. And when the television news did a poll of, what are you most worried about, or what do you think is the biggest issue on the table at the moment, the annexation came in last. It was something like, the economy and Corona, and then Netanyahu as corruption, and then all of the different things that Israelis care about and that affect their lives. And then annexation was like this much on the graph, and that was so striking because, of course, for Palestinian people, that it must be the opposite, that they're about to lose another half of the West Bank. So that multiverse that we are living in, that seems parallel, the narratives that construct that multiverse and make it seem as though we are living on completely different planets. That is those are the realities that settler colonialism constructs. So while the clip came out 10 years ago, I think it could have been shot yesterday. It could have been shot in Toronto. And I think that's incredibly telling, that until we undermine and destroy the relationships that we have towards each other, we're not going to resolve any of these conflicts.
Very good. Thank you very much, LIA TARACHANSKY. And we've shared with the attending audience a link to narrative production. So you use the phrase narrative, and you also mentioned your production company, so you can see more of LIA's work at Narrative Productions at the link that's been distributed. I'm going to ask you to stick around. We're going to be hearing from some others, but we want you all to come back for the question and answer at the end. The next panelist we have lined up is Dimitri Lascaris, a lawyer, journalist, and activist based in Montreal. He was a candidate in the 2015 federal election. He ran for the Green Party. He's been justice critic for the shadow cabinet of the Green Party and justice critic for the shadow cabinet of the Green Party of Quebec, so both Canada and Quebec. He's presently based in Montreal. He's running for the leadership of the Green Party of Canada, and right now he's actually at a live event in Victoria, BC. So we caught up with him earlier and ran some tape of, recorded some video of Dimitri answering a question about his experience of the Canadian state and Canadian government's attitude towards issues of Israeli settlements and related issues. So I'm going to hope that we have that video to run right now and play that for you, Dimitri's answer. I caught up with Dimitri Lascaris a little bit earlier and I asked him, from his perspective as a lawyer and an activist, as well as a candidate for the leadership of the Green Party of Canada, what he can tell us about the attitude of the Canadian government towards issues like this, towards issues of the occupied Palestinian territories, the Israeli settlements, and issues related to that. Dimitri?
David, I come from this this whole question of the Canadian government attitude towards the occupation and the settlements from the perspective of a lawyer, not just an activist. And I've had, I think, in my capacity as a lawyer, I've seen in a very stark and really disgraceful way how the Canadian government has effectively acceded to a de facto annexation of occupied territory by the State of Israel and its military forces. And I'm going to talk to you in particular about two cases that I've been involved in as a lawyer in a pro bono capacity for 4 or 5 years now. The battle continues. And the first one involves one of the other panelists today, a friend and client, REHAB NAZZAL, who I understand will be speaking shortly. And the story of REHAB's interactions with the Canadian government, and REHAB comes from Bethlehem, which is, of course, in the occupied West Bank. It really begins in late 2015 when she was in Bethlehem and was peacefully recording the activities of an Israeli skunk truck, which was pouring noxious fluid onto the homes of Palestinians in Bethlehem. And this was in the aftermath of one of the many protests that happens in Bethlehem against the occupation. And as she was filming the skunk truck, an Israeli sniper, we think we know who it is. We don't know the sniper's name, but we have photographic evidence which reveals who that person is, shot her in the leg, and she fell to the ground bleeding and wounded. And when a Palestinian ambulance tried to race to the scene and tried to give her treatment, the Israeli forces rained tear gas down on the ambulance. We also have photographs of the tear gas enveloping the ambulance as they were trying to treat REHAB. So first of all, she was acting in her capacity as a journalist. She posed no threat to anybody, and she was clearly targeted. She was standing by herself. This was almost certainly not an errant bullet. It was fired intentionally at her. She had a camera in her hands, so it could be seen that she was simply documenting activities of the occupation forces. And the efforts of the Israeli government, that was a war crime. The shooting of somebody who was acting in a journalistic capacity and posed no threat to anybody was a war crime. It is also a war crime to impede the treatment of a wounded civilian in occupied territory, which clearly happened here as well. So no less than 2 war crimes were committed in this case. And this is documented. And we not only have photographic evidence, we have a statement from a reporter of Agence France Presse, a French reporter, backing up REHAB's account of what happened. So I entered the scene some months after this because REHAB was not getting any kind of defense, any kind of support from the Canadian government, certainly none that she was aware of. And I took on the task as a pro bono lawyer to liaise with the Canadian government and try to ensure that the Canadian government would apply pressure on the State of Israel to hold this soldier accountable. And I started by sending a letter to Chrystia Freeland and to the ambassador to Israel at the time, who was Deborah Lyons. She's no longer there. She's moved on. And I laid out all the facts. I provided the evidence, including a statement of another reporter
Okay, sorry about that. We seem to have a technical problem in transmitting the video. Maybe we'll try to get that up again momentarily. I'm not sure if
This voluminous documentation, I know this to be the case because I've been told by the Access to Information Officer that there's voluminous documentation. And I've been told many times that it was going to be delivered to me, and I still haven't had it delivered to me. So I can't even get information from the Canadian government. And the other thing that happened in all of this, shortly after I communicated with the embassy, all of a sudden, an investigator from the IDF materialized and contacted me. And the IDF investigator asked for information about REHAB shooting. I provided all of the same evidence that I've described and which I provided to the Canadian government. And after an exchange that went on for some 3 or 4 months, the IDF investigator simply disappeared and ignored my request for further information. So I think one can safely say that the Canadian government has absolutely no interest in defending the rights of a Palestinian Canadian, a Canadian citizen who was in occupied territory in a journalistic capacity and who was subjected to 2 war crimes. I think that's quite revealing of the Canadian government's attitude towards the occupation and the settlements. The second case, which I've also been involved with for years, involved a member of the Canadian Jewish community, Dr. David Kattenberg, whom I've represented on a pro bono basis now for, I think it's been 3 years plus. And David admirably and on his own initiative in January 2017 filed a complaint with the Liquor Control Board of Ontario about wines produced in 2 illegal settlements in the West Bank and sold in Canada with Product of Israel labels. And after 6 months, during which he was not represented by anybody, including me, David managed to persuade the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, which has jurisdiction over the product labels on these wines, that the wines were false, misleading, deceptive, because according to the Canadian government's own long-standing policy and according to international law, the settlements do not constitute part of Israel. And therefore, telling Canadian consumers that these products are made in Israel is a lie. It's a bald-faced lie, which is demonstrably false. And so what happened when the CFIA communicated its decision to the Liquor Control Board of Ontario and told the Liquor Control Board of Ontario to take these settlement wines off the shelves until the labels were corrected? Very, very aggressive pro-Israel groups and politicians in this country began to apply intense pressure on the Canadian Food Inspection Agency to reverse itself, and it did so with lightning speed. It took 6 months to adjudicate David's complaint, and within less than 24 hours, it reversed itself, citing this obscure provision of the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement, which has nothing whatsoever to do with product labels. And we went to court over this. That's when I entered the scene as David's pro bono counsel. We filed what is called a judicial review application in the Federal Court of Canada. And after about 1.5 years of litigation, Justice Anne McTavish, who has now been elevated to the Federal Court of Appeal, rendered a decision in which she said clearly that the settlements, that the labels on these wines were false, misleading, and deceptive and violated Canadian law. What then happened was an even greater shame on the record of the Canadian government. It decided to appeal the decision. It was obviously the correct decision. The CFIA's initial decision was obviously the correct decision. Both of those decisions were perfectly consistent with the Trudeau government's own stated policies. And this was even the policy of the Harper government. Even Stephen Harper's government said that the settlements violated the Fourth Geneva Convention and that the West Bank was occupied Palestinian territory. And to this very day, this litigation has now been going on for more than 3 years. The Trudeau government has been battling us tooth and nail to effectively enable producers of products in Israel's illegal settlements to deceive the Canadian public. That's exactly what's going on. The government is participating in a consumer fraud being perpetrated on Canadian citizens by these war criminals, because that's what they are. The persons who are in these settlements profiting from the violations of the Fourth Geneva Convention are war criminals. So I think that we draw from these conclusions is not only that the Canadian government is hypocritical, but that effectively the Canadian government has endorsed a de facto annexation of the West Bank or large portions of the West Bank by the State of Israel. Whatever stated policy may be, it seems determined tooth and nail to immunize Israel from any form of accountability for the de facto annexation of occupied territory. And, I can understand why Canadians sitting at home dealing with the realities of day-to-day life might not think that this is an issue as unjust as it is that ought to preoccupy them. But I think that people who feel that way, and I know a great many Canadians do care very deeply about what's being done to Palestinians in our name. But even those who think, feel understandably that perhaps other more pressing needs should be of greater concern to them, it's important to them to understand that what is underlying this entire dispute is a bedrock principle of international law, something that emerged from the horrors of the Second World War, something which emerged from the immense suffering that aggressive states have caused in the past, including Nazi Germany, and that is the fundamental international prohibition on the acquisition of territory by conquest. It is a primordial principle of international law that we do not tolerate the acquisition of territory by conquest, because if we do, it will lead to eventually to the kinds of devastating wars that we have experienced. We experienced in the first half of the 20th century, and the destructive capacity of the militaries of the world today is far in excess of what it was then. So we are even more threatened by military conflict that is motivated by a desire to acquire territory by conquest. This really is something that is of fundamental importance to the security and the safety of every single person alive in the world today. And that is why we have to demand that the Canadian government uphold this principle and hold the state of Israel accountable for acquiring this occupied territory by conquest.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dimitri, who, as I say, we plan to have joining us later. We are now going to go to REHAB NAZZAL. REHAB is a Canadian Palestinian artist, currently speaking to us from Ramallah. She's earlier from Bethlehem, and in between she's lived in different places in Canada, including here in London, Ontario, where she did a doctorate in visual arts and culture at the University of Western Ontario. She received a Social Science and Humanities Research Council doctoral award. Her work has been exhibited in Palestine and Canada, internationally in group and solo works. Her work involves video, photography, sound works, focusing on the violence of settler colonialism. REHAB, can you join us and tell us a little bit about the video that we're about to see? Not, we can go directly to, here's REHAB. Hi, thank you for joining us today from REHAB. It's later, obviously, where you are. Tell us about the video we're about to see, the video you created about Canada Park.
Well, I created this video in 2015, and there is a testimony, a main testimony in it, which is of a friend of ours who is from one of the villages that Canada Park was established over its rules. So the second day of the occupation in 1967, Israeli occupation forces forced 10,000 Palestinians, residents of the three villages of Mondoweiss, Beit Nuba, and Yalo, forced them to leave their homes, many of them on foot, and they destroyed the three villages. The video itself is going to tell more details about this, but it's relevant, this specific work, because it is the first annexation of Palestinian land in the West Bank that took place after 1967. So we are actually in the process itself that started on the 6th of June. So I guess I can elaborate later after seeing the video.
Great, thanks so much for setting it up for us. Jace, if the video is ready, we'll go to that now.
زرتها بشكل يعني غير رسمي، لأنه أي واحد منا هون عشان يدخل مناطق 48 بده تصريح، ما كان عم صح لي تصريح.
وميزت بيتكم؟
ميزته يعني بعد صعوبة ميزته. تميز البيت يعني إما بدك يعني انطلاقا من شجرة معينة أو سلسلة أو مكان مميز. أذكر كان في يعني مغارة مجاورة للبيت وفي عدد من شجرات الصنوبر بالضبط، يعني كان بإمكاني أحدد. بعد جهد غير قليل تمكنت من تمييز البيت. عاملين زي مقاعد خشبية أشبه بالبنس هناك تحت الآية، فكان في شجرة يعني كبيرة كنا دائما نجلس تحتها. رحت يعني 3-4 مرات، ما في تغدينا هناك تحت الشجر، يعني أماكن يعني مرتبطة بطفولتي، يعني بعرف الأرض وشجر معين الأخير لا زال موجود. ربما لاحظت المقبرة موجودة، وفي بعض الأماكن الدينية لا زالوا موجودين، وبقايا يعني حدود لبعض البيوت، سلسلة مغارة شجرة معينة هي فقط التي تميز القرية بعد هدمها. نقطة تجمع المياه والبير إذا شفتيه،
شفت
يعني يوميا كنت أروح عنده. ورحت وزرت يعني الأراضي اللي لنا هناك، يعني في جبل ويعني قطع أراضي وأحراش والى آخره، يعني مرتبطة بالطفولة. زرتها شيء 4-5 مرات أنا، يعني كانت عادة. طلبوا من كل الناس انه يغادروا تحت عنوان نفتش البيوت بيوم 6 حزيران. بعد ما غادروا في يعني منطقة جنب كانت القرية زي ملعب، فظلوا يطردوا فيهم ومنعوهم العودة، منعوهم حتى ياخذوا أي شيء من أغراضهم. مشي يعني وصولا لعدد من القرى من عمواس لرامله. عندما هدموا القرى بما في عمواس في 14 واحد استشهدوا تحت الردم، يعني منهم واحد بعرفه شخصيا كان كسيح يعني ما بقدرش يمشي، وكذا ست كبيرة بالعمر ما قدرت تطلع، ما كانوا مصدقين
هدموا البيوت عليهم،
استشهدوا بال67 هدموا البيوت عليهم. عرضت أفلام وأقيمت يعني مظهر لإحياء الذكرى بالقصد الثقافي، وكان حاضر مثلا ممثلين من السفارة الكندية أو الممثلين الكنديين، واعتبرنا هذا شيء مهم لأن الفيلم عرض لقطات تصويرية عن القرية قبل 48 قبل 67 بعد 67. وبالنقاش أثيرت المسؤولية الأدبية للسلطات الكندية المعنية، كونها أسهمت بتمويل هذا المنتزه الذي يقيم على قرية مهدمة دون مراعاة أن عم يقام منتزه أو متنزه فوق بشر جرى إشهادهم في هذه القرية. وتحدث عندها الممثلية الكندية بلغة إيجابية، يعني قائلا بأن يعني الصورة واضحة، سأنقل كل ما رأيت وما سمعت للجهات المعنية في بلدي. وكان الاتجاه العام المتحدث يعني في هذا السياق يطالب ليس فقط أولا بوقف أي مساعدات لتجمع من هذا النوع، إنما بالتدقيق ومحاسبة تلك المساعدات التي تذهب خدمة لمشاريع استيطانية تقام على أرض الغير، وهي جزء من العملية القضائية. وكان ولا يزال بتقدير مطلوب مزيد من الضغط على الجهات الكندية المعنية وفضح ممارسات من هذا النوع، لأن من يريد أن يساعد أي من التجمعات البشرية لا يساعدها عندما تكون على حساب موت وقتل مجموعات بشرية أخرى، كما هو الحال بالنسبة للقرى الثلاث وموقف السلطات أو الجهات الكندية التي أسهمت بتمويل مشروع المنتزه.
Thank you, Rehab, for that. Powerful, very powerful. And for those who missed it going by, there was a mention in there of the organization which funds Canada Park here in Canada and worldwide, but this one in particular in Canada, people made tax-deductible donations to the Jewish National Fund. And since it's deducted from their taxes, that means we all pay for it. Everybody who pays taxes in Canada subsidizes the displacement, the war crime of the Jewish National Fund's work displacing Palestinians from their land in Canada. So as you said earlier, annexation never stopped. It's continuing and ongoing. And the campaign that Anna just shared a link to, the Jewish Independent Jewish Voices Canada, an organization here, has been campaigning for some time to end the charitable status of the Jewish National Fund, but because clearly the work is not charitable. I mean, the example that we just saw was a war crime. Talk to us more about the film and the context, please, Reha.
Well, the destruction of these three villages is an episode of the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from their homeland, which started in 1947, 1948, upon the establishment of the State of Israel. And this ethnic cleansing is continuing since then. The plight of the three villages of Amwas, Yalo, and Beit Nuba manifest what 800,000 Palestinians have encountered when they were forced to leave their homes during the Nakba. Then the newly established State of Israel demolished over hundreds of their villages, towns, and neighborhoods in major cities. And the Jewish National Fund financed the cover-up of these crimes and to prevent Palestinian refugees from return. The Palestinian refugees who constitute, according to the UNRWA, 5.6 million still to this day hold the right to return. Of course, these include 10,000 refugees and their descendants from Amwas, Yalo, and Beit Nuba. And the refugees of these villages, the majority of them still live actually in a refugee camp in Jordan, Al-Baqa refugee camp. So Canada Park demonstrates the complicity of Canada and other Western countries in the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and the deprivation of the Palestinian refugees from return to their homes and lands. It covering up these crimes by itself is a war crime. The violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention is stark, and it's so being repeated over and over, and Canada is complicit. It's not the first park, by the way, to cover up the dispossession and expulsion of Palestinians. Other Western countries, there is a park called Britannia, British park, that was established in 1950 over the ruins of 3 depopulated and demolished Palestinian villages of Der Debouan, Ajur, and Kidnap. So the case of these parks reveal how foreign Western charitable organizations can be allotted privately owned Palestinian lands, appropriated from their owners and allotted by the State of Israel to these organizations. And I mean here the Jewish National Fund and of Canada specifically. It reveals how Israel and these organizations violate the Fourth Geneva Convention, including Articles 53 and 49. The Jewish National Fund of Canada represents the destruction of Palestinian lives and Palestinian culture to non-informed populations. I would put it between 2 quotations because whoever wants to be informed would go and look for the truth. Mm-hmm. But it presented as a humane environmental act, between 2 quotations in their website, help people and care for the environment, while in fact, it carries out forestation of fast-growing non-indigenous trees to conceal the ruins of the Palestinian towns and villages and lives. At the same time, what's happening now, and I'll show you some images, the Israeli settlers are uprooting, burning, killing mountains of olive trees so the Jewish National Fund can replant these non-indigenous trees. And I will share with you my screen. How much time I have?
Just a minute or two more.
Okay, okay, I'll go over that. I was here actually going to show you some names of those donors whose name appear in Canada Park. And I was interested in the ones from Toronto. In the West Bank, since 1967, there are many sites that are designated as military closed zones, such as this one in the Jordan Valley, or this one in Bethlehem district. And look at the forest the Jewish National Fund plants in the back, where the olive trees are being destroyed. Either military closed zone or nature reserve. Israel is using this in the West Bank, and they announced in January they will establish another few nature reserve. And this is preparation for new settlements or extending or expanding the existing settlements. So all these you see in the Jordan Valley. I had a residency last January in Jericho, and I was shocked by all these sites that have demolished places. The Israelis use abandoned, but they are closed military zones. They are being prepared for the next step of annexation. Demolishing homes. This is in Bethlehem, in Ramallah. Beside the settlements that actually create the wine that Canadians consume. Here in Bethlehem, Beit Jala, a restaurant and a house were destroyed. You can see in the far settlement, this is the house and the restaurant, and a single settler comes and builds a caravan here on top of the Mahrur, which is a World Heritage Site. The only recreational sites remain for Bethlehem and the region. A single one you can see from here. This is Al-Mahrur, and this is the single settler who came, guarded by the soldiers. And here the restaurant and the house. The destruction of olive trees, the burning of olive trees by settlers, guarded by soldiers, it is a crime. It's an environmental crime that has to stop. Just last week, these in Bureen, they're burning Bureen. Bureen itself, all its mountains, if you can see here. This is from Hebron, also Hebron Mountains. But here, Bureen, around Nablus, you can see hundreds of olive trees being burned. Around Bethlehem, the settlement expansion is increasing in unprecedented way. Day and night, bulldozers are working. And no one in these buildings, by the way, at night you can figure out. But they're expanding. And here is the olive trees, and beside them, the fern trees in Bethlehem region. That's last week I was in a demonstration in this beautiful village in Nablus, Asira al-Shamaliya. And that's what the Israeli army blocked the road, that the villagers cannot access their land. And here written in Arabic, this is a closed military zone, you can't enter it. And here it is, the protesters and the soldiers. Okay.
Thanks for that powerful work, Rehab. And for those who haven't seen it, if you get an opportunity to see Rehab's exhibits anywhere, please rush. Don't walk to attend any of her shows. I've seen a very powerful show on just something that was glimpsed there briefly, the destruction of olive trees. Very, very powerful images. For our last panelist, I wanted to introduce, we will have time for the Q&A, so thank you for your questions. We will get to them for the last segment of the webinar. I'd like to introduce my colleague, who happens to have been one of the doctoral examiners for Rehab's doctoral thesis at Western University, where she did her PhD and where Michael works. Professor Michael Link is the UN Special Rapporteur. He's a professor of law and teaching in human rights and labor law and disability and other topics like that at Western since 20 years, a little bit more than 20 years. And 4 years ago was appointed as the UN Human Rights Council Special Rapporteur for the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories. He's issued 4 reports and another one just coming out. We have a link to his, where you can find out more about the work of the Special Rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories. Michael, you've published recently on Canada's response to the annexation. Your thoughts on this topic, on annexation generally, and what Canada has done, how little it's done, what it could be doing, what people in general could be doing.
Sure. Thank you very much for that, David, and thank you for having me today. If I can, I'm going to speak generally about the issues of annexation and then about one of the particular themes in my report that was just released and delivered to the UN Human Rights Council on Thursday, and I'll wrap up with a few comments with respect to Canada's position on annexation. What I first want to address to everybody is the issue that's on everybody's lips, which is the looming threat of annexation by Israel of more of the West Bank. I addressed the issue of annexation as a special topic in my October 2018 report to the UN General Assembly, and I mention it briefly again in my current report. But what I want to point out, and I think should be accessible to people, is that a month ago, in the middle of June, I joined with 66 other UN human rights experts in a common statement denouncing Israel's plans for annexation. The statement was widely quoted in news reports around the world and briefly stated, the statement made 4 central points. First, annexation is a fundamental violation of international law, starting with the Charter of the United Nations in 1945, and including the 8 occasions between 1967 and 2016, when the UN Security Council has stated that the acquisition of territory by force or war is inadmissible, with specific reference to Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories. Second, what would be left of the West Bank following annexation would be a Palestinian Bantustan, islands of disconnected land completely surrounded by Israel and with no territorial connection to the outside world. Israel has recently promised that it plans to maintain permanent security control between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, regardless if there's an agreement with the Palestinians or not. Thus, the morning after Israeli annexation would be the crystallization of an already unjust reality: 2 peoples living in the same space, ruled by the same state, but with profoundly unequal rights. This, as I said, along with my 66 fellow UN human rights experts, this would be a vision of a 21st century apartheid. Third, the already massive pattern of human rights violations associated with the occupation, including my theme of my current report on collective punishment, would only likely intensify and get worse in the aftermath of the annexation. And fourth, the international community criticized Israel when it annexed East Jerusalem in 1980 and the Syrian Golan Heights in 1981. But in neither occasion did it take any meaningful countermeasures to oppose Israel's actions. Obviously, it hasn't taken any meaningful actions with respect to Israel's settlements either, or with the location of the wall that snakes through the West Bank, or with any of the other human rights violations that various UN bodies have wound up pointing their fingers at. This time must be different. Accountability and an end to impunity must become an immediate priority for the international community. Now, one of the areas of massive human rights violations that I've just referenced, which I fear would only intensify in the aftermath of annexation, is collective punishment, which is the theme of the report that I released this past week. Collective punishment is an inflamed scar that runs across the entire 53-year-old Israeli occupation of Palestine. Over these years, 2 million Palestinians in Gaza have endured a comprehensive air, sea, and land blockade since 2007. Several thousand Palestinian homes have been punitively demolished. Extended curfews have paralyzed entire towns and regions. Mass arrests have occurred. The bodies of dead Palestinians have been withheld from their families, and critical civilian supplies, including food, water, and utilities, have been denied at various times. Notwithstanding numerous resolutions, reports, and reminders critical of its use, Israel continues to rely upon collective punishment as a prominent instrument in its coercive tool of population control. A fundamental tenet of any legal system, domestic or international, which respects the rule of law, is the principle that the innocent cannot be punished for the crimes of others. A corollary of this tenet is that the collective punishment of communities or groups of peoples for offenses committed by individuals is absolutely prohibited under international law. Throughout history and in contemporary times, belligerent armies, colonial authorities, and occupying powers have commonly employed a spectrum of collective punishment measures against civilian populations hostile to their alien rule. The methods used have included civilian executions, sustained curfews and closures of towns, food confiscation and starvation, punitive property damagement, the capture of hostages, economic closures on civilian populations, the cutting off of power and water supplies, withholding of medical supplies, collective fines, and mass detentions. These punishments are, in the words of the International Committee of the Red Cross, and I quote, in defiance of the most elementary principles of humanity. And that's why the world has prohibited collective punishment through Article 33 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, allowing for no exceptions to this prohibition. So let me now address the issue of Gaza as a form of collective punishment, which is one of the areas I spend particular time examining in my current UN report. In June 2007, 13 years ago, Israel initiated a comprehensive air, sea, and land closure of Gaza, which it maintains to this day. The impact of Israel's closure has been to turn Gaza from a low-income society with modest but growing export ties to the regional and international economy to an impoverished ghetto with a decimated economy and a collapsing social service system. In 2012, the United Nations wondered whether Gaza, given its trajectory, would still be livable by 2020. In a follow-up report in 2017, the UN found that life in Gaza was deteriorating even faster than anticipated. And in 2020, the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process observed that the immense suffering of the population in Gaza has continued. An important purpose behind Israel's closure of Gaza is to accelerate the separation of Gaza from the West Bank, just as Israel actively works to separate the West Bank from East Jerusalem. Creating and entrenching the fragmentation of these territories beyond sinking the chances for creating a viable Palestinian economy, as well as blocking Palestinians from building the larger collective and political bonds with each other that nourishes a functioning society. This is designed to prevent the independence of a state of Palestine. As Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stated in 2019, in response to criticisms within Israel about his decision to allow Qatar to fund construction and utility projects in Gaza, and I quote, "Whoever is against the Palestinian state should be for transferring the funds to Gaza, because maintaining a separation between the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza helps prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state," stop quotes. In my report, I conclude that the actions of Israel towards the protected population in Gaza amounts to collective punishment under international law. The 2 million Palestinians of Gaza are not responsible for the deeds of Hamas and other militant groups, yet they have endured a substantial share of the punishment, intentionally so. Israel appears content to allow for the delivery of basic humanitarian requirements to Gaza, almost entirely provided by international aid, but to then turn the spigot of any modest additional assistance or economic activity off and on, depending on the circumstances. I remind Israel in my report that it is required under the 14 Geneva Convention to, and I'm quoting, to ensure to the fullest extent possible of the means available to it that the occupying power supply food and medical supplies to the population. Economically, Gaza continues to steadily de-develop. Its GDP, its gross domestic product, per capita has declined by 30% from around $1,880 American in 2012 to $1,410 in 2019-2020. Its unemployment rate has increased from almost 31% in 2012 to 46% this past year, among the very highest rates of unemployment in the world. And that was before the coronavirus struck. Virtually the only economic pulse that Gaza still has is the result of external aid and remittance transfers, which made up close to 100% of the economy in 2014 and have been steadily declining in volume since 2017. Gaza's social sector is the second prominent area to be adversely affected by Israel's closure policy. Gaza's population has increased by 25% since 2012 to 2 million people, but its living standards have sharply declined since then. Gaza in 2020 does not provide living standards that meet the international standards of human rights, including the right to development. The numbers of Gazans living under the poverty line as of 2017 stood at 53%, which was up from 39% in 2011. And the World Bank predicts that this is going to rise to 64%. Food insecurity increased from 44% of the population in 2012 to 62% in 2018. Gaza has no reliable supply of electoral power. It's 96% of the coastal aquifer, its main supply of drinking water, is not fit for consumption. And Gaza's healthcare system is severely depleted and has been brought close to collapse by the closure and by the cycle of escalating attacks on the Strip. In my report, I conclude that collective punishment is a tool of control and domination that is antithetical to the modern rule of law. It defies the foundational legal principle that only the guilty shall incur penalties for their actions after having been found responsible through a fair process. Prohibitions against the practice of collective punishment are found in virtually all legal systems across the globe. The deeds of a few cannot, under any circumstances, justify the punishment of the innocent, even in a conflict zone, even under occupation, even during times of popular discontent and security challenges. Like torture, there are no permissible exceptions to the use of collective punishment in law. And like torture, the use of collective punishment flaunts law and morality, dignity and justice, and stains all those who practice it. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. I was muted there, but I was following what you were saying. So we're just about in time for the Q&A section. I wanted to respond to one of the questions that was out there with a greeting to Brother Ali Mallah, who used to be with our campaign and still does great work against the occupation in Toronto and the GTA, asks about the Canadian-Palestinian Action Network of a few years ago. We attended those meetings. I haven't seen the actions from it. There is a BDS network. There are other Canadian networks. Of course, our campaign, the Canadian Boat to Gaza, part of the Freedom Flotilla, continues to sail. We sailed 2 years ago with the Just Future for Palestine. Dimitri was on that as a journalist. We had some great videos of his interviews still on the Real News Network site, the Real News Network, where Leah used to work as well as Israel-Palestine correspondent. So our work continues specifically against the case that Michael was just talking about, specifically against the collective punishment of Palestinian civilians in Gaza through the blockade. So that part continues to answer your question, Ali, and thank you for joining us today. We have other questions here, including 2 petitions. One just got pasted into the chat for everybody to see. petition on from Dr. David Kattenberg in Winnipeg, sponsored by Elizabeth May, on banning settlement products, excluding settlement products from the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement, and withdrawing the charitable status from the Jewish National Fund, the organization behind the war crime that we saw in the REHAB's film. So, and there's a second petition there, also sponsored by a Green Party member, Paul Manley, which we'll try to send out to you shortly. So for the Q&A, I'm going to ask everybody to come back, Michael, Rehab, and Leah, and hopefully we will be joined shortly by Dimitri as well, who should be arriving from another event. We have lots of questions coming from the public. I would like to ask in particular, apart from sharing the information that we're sending back by text channel, one of the viewers, Basma, asks about the exact political scenario that took place in 1948 that resulted in the displacement of 700,000 Palestinian refugees. The exact details this listener feels are too blurry. Could we get some clarity about what happened then, and perhaps about Canada's role? Michael, you've looked at Canada's role in the 47-48 partition agreement, and let's just say that as we are complicit now, the Canadian government was complicit then. But please tell us what you can tell us about the circumstances of the 47 partition agreement and the 48 displacement of the refugees.
Or very briefly, and this is outside of my role as a special rapporteur. This is something that I've been doing as an academic. I've been looking with the idea of wanting to write a book on the 1947 Partition Plan developed by the United Nations. And I'm wondering if someone can turn off their, can mute themselves. I can hear a lot of background noise, which is distracting. Okay, thank you. In 1947, the United Kingdom decided to give up the mandate for the running of Palestine, a mandate that had been given to it by the League of Nations in the early 1920s, and turn that over to the United Nations. The United Nations, in turn, set up a special committee on Palestine, otherwise known as UNSCOP, which during the summer of 1947 toured Palestine and some neighboring countries to get opinions with respect to what should be the future of Mandate Palestine. One of the 11 commissioners was the Supreme Court of Canada Justice, Ivan Rand, who actually later on became the very first dean of the law school I now teach at Western Law at Western University. And the report of UNSCOP was delivered at the very end of August 1947. Of the 11 commissioners, 7 voted in favor of dividing Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. 3 commissioners voted in favor of some kind of federated, unified state for both Jews and Palestinians in the area, and 1 commissioner did not vote at all. Among the 7 was Ivan Rand. I know that subsequently he was declared to be, because of his role in the committee, to be one of the called the Balfour of Canada with respect to his role in supporting the division of Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. And others have written with respect to the role of Lester Pearson. I'm less familiar with that, but that's sort of the brief answer that I can wind up providing.
Thanks so much, Michael. Another question from the audience: what are Palestinians allowed to do under? What can Palestinians do against annexation under international law? Is there any kind of case that can be filed, or governments that support them? What types of action can be taken?
I'll jump in and start with that. I would certainly welcome others to want to answer that as well. You know, right now, Palestinians have initiated a complaint in January 2015 at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And this complaint has finished its first of 3 stages. There's presently a question before one of the courts at the International Criminal Court as to whether or not the court has jurisdiction over war crimes that may have occurred in the occupied Palestinian territory. And we're expecting a decision sometime either later in August or in September with respect to that. If that question is answered in the affirmative, that the International Criminal Court can proceed, it will go to a second stage, which is a formal investigation conducted by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. And essentially what they're looking at is whether or not war crimes were committed by Israel during its conflict in 2014 on Gaza, where approximately 1,500 Palestinian civilians were killed. It's looking at war crimes with respect to the shootings that occurred by the Israeli military between 2018 and 2019 at the frontier of Gaza. Thirdly, it's looking at whether or not settlements are war crimes under the 1998 Rome Statute. And fourthly, it's looking at whether or not Hamas or other militant groups based in Gaza have committed war crimes by firing rockets either intentionally or indiscriminately towards populated communities and towns and cities within Israel. The second thing that can be done, and it's something that I think there's growing questions and advocacy for, is whether the Palestinians might want to raise another advisory opinion to be asked of the International Court of Justice, which also sits in The Hague, as to whether or not annexation is legal under international law, and whether or not the Israeli annexations of East Jerusalem, of the Golan Heights, and now the intended annexation of further parts of the West Bank would be lawful or not under international law. And I think that would be a very straightforward question and a very straightforward answer coming from the court. Of course, annexation has been absolutely prohibited since 1945. They may also ask the question of whether or not an occupation that's now gone on for 53 years is now become illegal under international law. Certainly aspects of the occupation, the settlements, the annexations, the location of the wall, human rights violations, and other aspects of the way in which Israel has conducted the occupation have been found to be illegal or illegitimate under international law. But the question would be to put to the court is whether the entire occupation has now become illegal because Israel has not tried to leave the occupation and end it and hand it back to the territory back to the Palestinians in a period as quickly as possible. And another question that could be put before the International Court of Justice is what are the third state responsibilities for ending the occupation? What is the responsibility of the international community, particularly since the issue of Palestine and Israel has been a question before the United Nations since 1947. The United Nations specifically, and the international community generally, continues to have an ongoing international responsibility for this issue until it's finally and justly resolved. So those might be questions that we put to the International Court of Justice for resolution.
Thank you, Michael. Rehab, how does it look from the ground, from where you are in Ramallah? And I know you, to the extent that it's possible, you travel around a bit occupied Palestinian territories for your work. I mean, the photographs that we saw and some of your video work and some of your other art denounces the situations in different places. So how does it feel from the point of view of Palestinians in the occupied territories that you've been able to witness to face the current threat of annexation and, as you've described so eloquently, the ongoing annexation? Please unmute your mic.
Yeah, okay. As you know, for the past 27 years, the Palestinians have been living the illusion of peace with Israel, the Oslo Accords. And despite the difference between the Palestinian Authority, the official position, and the popular position and stance on Oslo Accords, finally the Palestinian Authority ended this accord. I mean, that's what we're hoping, actually, because there are so many international parties who are trying to pressure the Palestinian Authority to go back into negotiations. Negotiations on what? No one knows. However, what Michael indicated about the role internationally, that's what we're hoping for. Now, on the ground, as I said, after 27 years of suppression of the Palestinian popular movement, the Palestinian popular resistance by the Palestinian Authority, and by the way, Canada supported the Palestinian Authority police, actually trained them and funded them how to suppress the Palestinian resistance. It is going slowly back to a state of what we're hoping all to be intifada in many areas, in many regions, in many districts where there is a threat of the settlers and the occupation army, people organizing protests on weekly basis in Kufr Qaddoum and Asir al-Shamaliya, around Ramallah here. But of course, all this comes within the struggle with coronavirus. We're actually experiencing a fierce second wave, and it's hitting East Jerusalem the most. But still, despite that, weekly protests are taking place. Yesterday was a victory, basically in one of the mounts beside Nablus, Beta, where a few settlers came with caravans and they want to start a settlement, but the residents pushed them, and we understood they left that site. So we have nothing, actually. We don't have an army. Probably people always ask me, we don't have an army. We don't have weapons. We don't have Israel's weapon arsenal or the support that Israel gets and the weapons and whatever. But the popular resistance continues, and it will continue.
Thank you. So we've heard two perspectives there on popular resistance on the one hand, perhaps diplomatic legal course channels, as Michael mentioned. I see that Dimitri has joined us now. Dimitri, thank you for joining us after your event, Dimitri. And Leah is on screen as well. If you have thoughts about how people are resisting annexation, we have some questions from our social media audience. Israel is in violation of so many international laws. What will it take to have the United Nations take action against these violations? And why does Israel enjoy so much impunity for its actions? What can be done about it as it relates to Canadian politics? So I'll just mention that you've all had links now to receive 2 links to petitions, Canadian parliamentary petitions, sponsored, as it turns out, by members of parliament from the Green Party, by Paul Manley and by Elizabeth May. That we already mentioned, addressing settlement products, the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement, and the charitable status for the fake charity, the JNF, and another one about a special envoy focusing on Palestinian children in detention. So those are 2 actions Canadian citizens anywhere, Canadian residents can take, simply signing that on, and especially sharing it. Obviously, these actions in Parliament are the stronger, the more people get behind them. So don't just sign. Share it around you and get other people to sign. Other thoughts on actions that can be taken by Canadians or by other people watching, and about Israeli impunity on the international stage. Thank you for joining us, Dimitri. Did you have anything to add now, or Leah? The anti-GNF campaign is something that Independent Jewish Voices was involved with as well. Sorry, please go ahead.
Well, the impunity, I think, flows entirely from the fact that Western governments are essentially unequivocally supportive of the government of Israel's agenda. And so long as those governments, and particularly governments holding a veto power at the UN Security Council, are supportive of Israel's agenda, then there is going to be impunity, at least at the level of government sanctions, major government sanctions. So, and as long as those governments are continuing to engage in deeper trade relationships with Israel and supporting Israel politically, economically, and other ways, Israel will enjoy impunity, effective impunity, no matter how much international condemnation it may have to endure from time to time. So what this means really is that we have to focus our efforts on the major Western governments that are supporting the state of Israel's agenda. And we have to change public opinion here, and we have to apply enough pressure on our own politicians in countries like Canada. Canada is one of the worst offenders when it comes to defending the government of Israel's agenda. We have to apply public pressure here and expose the hypocrisy of our governments here in order to have any hope of overcoming this effective impunity that the government of Israel has enjoyed on the international stage. And that's working. You look at public opinion polls over time. I think there is a clear trend here in Canada and the United States, two of the countries that have been most supportive of the government of Israel, towards a rejection of this impunity. And now you're even hearing members of Congress, talk about conditioning United States military aid to the state of Israel on its compliance with certain human rights norms. This is unprecedented. I think Betty McCollum herself, a U.S. congressperson, I believe that within the last year and a half, she referred to what Israel is doing to occupied Palestinians as a form of apartheid. So the conversation is changing. This is where we can contribute, those of us who live in Western states, is exposing the hypocrisy of our own governments and applying pressure to ensure that they actually hold all human rights violators, including the state of Israel, accountable.
Thanks, Dimitri. Rehab, please unmute and tell us what you have to say. Unmute, camera, the microphone.
Yes. I think we are learning as Palestinians, who, by the way, we constitute half the population on the historic Palestine. According to the Bureau of Statistics, the Israeli and the Palestinians, we are equal in numbers, Palestinians and Israelis. So learning from experiences of other countries, other nations who suffered with settler colonialism, we on the ground direct our attention to the citizens of the world. I'm not speaking about governments, which is great what's happening. So the BDS is at least it's the weapon that we can use. And in Canada, we need to legitimize this after the European Court considered it a legitimate form of human rights, of freedom of expression. So the BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanction, that's what we all can do. At least we don't need any force, not to consume Israeli products, not to attend Israeli conferences, etc. So that's one point. And the other point I want to make, which is instead of being dragged to ending, stop annexation, we have to focus on ending the occupation of 1967. Ending the occupation itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Rehab. Anything to add, Michael or Leah, on this point?
Well, I think I might have a slightly different analysis of this particular moment. But you know, I've worked in the West Bank as a journalist for almost a decade, covering the annexation and the destruction and the provocations that Rehab was talking about. And while, you know, they are such obvious, egregious violations of morality and international law, there is a particular intention behind them, which is to use any means necessary in order to expand the territory under the rule of the Israeli government and minimize the non-Israeli population in that area. And that was the motivation behind the ethnic cleansings that took place in the 1940s and in the 1960s and have been going on ever since. Because Israeli colonialism is about the land, it's not about the people. It has been focused on how to expand that land and to remove as many non-Israelis from that land as possible. So whether that means agitating against specific farmers by burning down their trees or confiscating swaths of private land or destroying villages or renaming villages, or as they call them in the annals of the Jewish National Fund, Europeanizing and beautifying the landscape, meaning changing the landscape from a Middle Eastern landscape to a European one, to look European as part of European Israeli settler colonialism. Behind all these things is the same intention, which is a settler colonial intention. And having worked in the West Bank and seen what the manifestation of that, it's become very clear that Israel has annexed the west swaths of the West Bank the second that it pretended in the Oslo Accords that it was signing a transitionary temporary agreement in order to achieve a two-state solution. Those agreements that were signed in the 90s were always intended by most parties to be temporary resolutions that would establish structures on which two states could exist in the future, and perhaps the Israeli leaders who were there at the time, some of them perhaps signed them with good intentions and with that in mind. The bottom line is that the colonial aspects and the colonial elements within the Israeli government and the Israeli society have won over ever since, and have manipulated these situations in order to minimize the land on which Palestinians live and maximize the land on which settlers can be used, and also take the initiative to create strongholds that hold on to land in order so that we can claim that this is now ours, and this is now ours, and this is not ours. That has been the case. The annexation has happened. And with Israel announcing that the annexation is now official, I think that it's revealing something that is now undeniable, which is that it is a colonial state which is intending to take. The BDS movement that started in 2005, that has been calling for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions of the state of Israel until it starts to respect international laws. That movement has had some profound achievements in terms of popular opinion abroad, but it had also had some interesting and profound impacts economically, because there's been not only boycotts of various Israeli companies and corporations that profit, but there's also been a whole number of a whole plethora of disengagement of international, especially European corporations in the Israeli economy as a result of what became a heavy price, including some persecutions in the Netherlands, investigations into various corporations that were building the apartheid wall, and so on. So the price became so that a number of Western, North American, European corporations started to disengage from the Israeli economy. And what the Israeli Minister of Economy at the time did, and what the government is doing until now, is turn to other states on which to lean on. And what we're seeing now is Israel is strengthening its relationship with India. It's strengthening its relationship with the Philippines. It's strengthening its relationships with Kenya. And it's going to states where there is a much less rigorous respect for international law and human rights. It's forming close relationships with leaders that are leading really brutal regimes, such as Duterte in the Philippines, and the nationalist movements of Modi in India. And it's finding allies in these repressive regimes. And so it is basically relocating itself from trying to locate itself for 70 years as a respectable European-like nation that is just doing the same thing that Europeans have been doing, creating settlements and creating colonies around the world. It is now understanding, the Israeli government is finally understanding that it's going to have to relocate itself in a different kind of international community, the international community that is hostile to international law. And
I'm going to cut you off there. Just sorry, but we do have a ton of questions here. We're not going to get to all your questions, folks. Spoiler alert, you're a bunch of very interesting points of view here. I would like to get to a few more in the time we have. Sorry, Leah. Question from Facebook audience. How come my Canadian parents raise a lawsuit against Israel for their properties that were confiscated in Ashkelon and Ramallah? Those two cities were part of the Arab state supposed to be part of the Arab state under the Partition Plan, but not part of Israel, now part of Israel since the 1948 war. What about access to our cities? holding Israel responsible for preventing our families returning to our cities. Is there anything to be done in Canadian courts in this regard? A question perhaps for Dimitri and Michael. And while we're on the question of Canadian law, can we, as Canadian citizens, can we not refuse to be complicit with our governments in their refusal to respect Canada's own Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act of 2000? So 2 different Canadian legal questions. I don't know if either Michael or Dimitri wants to tackle either of those.
I'm happy to answer one or both, but I think Michael should go next because I've already spoken. So, and then I can follow Michael and add my thoughts.
You know, Dimitri, let me ask you to go first, because you're the one who's got experience with respect to litigation in Canadian courts. That's the experience I do not have.
Okay. So there was a case that was brought in the Quebec Superior Court a few years ago on behalf of Palestinian Canadian who's I believe he sought to pursue a case. I think it was called Bilan or something along those lines. He sought to pursue a Canadian corporation that was complicit in the settlement project. And the Quebec Superior Court ruled, I think it went up to the Court of Appeal, ruled that the courts of Israel had jurisdiction over this matter. So the problem you confront in the Canadian context when you try to pursue human rights violations, I mean, first of all, if you're dealing with the state itself, you're going to run into the whole question of state immunity, which can be an incredible, just a barrier, an insuperable barrier to success. But even if you go after private actors, so you go after businesses or individuals who are situated in, who are committed the wrong in a foreign country, the Canadian courts are generally going to defer to the courts of that foreign country. And in some circumstances, they'll take jurisdiction over the case. This is the fancy Latin term for this whole issue is forum non-conveniens. What is the most convenient forum? One way you can get the Canadian court to take the case is if you can convince the Canadian court that the plaintiff cannot get justice in the foreign jurisdiction. So unfortunately, that is not a battle that has yet been won in a Canadian court, to my knowledge. There's never been a case where somebody a Palestinian who had been, whose rights had been violated, was able to pursue a violator of his or her rights in a Canadian court on the basis that the Israeli courts would not give justice to the plaintiff or could not do so. Now, I wouldn't rule out the possibility of that happening, but it's a big hill to climb, because for the court to make that determination, a Canadian court to make that determination, it would be a really powerful and negative political statement on the quality of justice being dispensed by the courts of Israel. And it would take a particularly courageous judge, politically courageous judge, in my view, I don't know if Michael agrees with this, to actually say that Palestinians cannot get justice in the courts of Israel. So I'm skeptical that it could be done. I wouldn't rule it out. That was just one court. And I think as the conduct of the Israeli government becomes more and more extreme, the chances of success will rise in terms of getting a Canadian court to hear that claim. But I don't know that we're there yet. The other thing I will say is that if you're going to attempt this, if a Palestinian Canadian living in Canada is going to attempt to get justice through the Canadian civil court system against a violator of Palestinian human rights, it's really important to structure the case in such a way that it has as many connections to Canada as possible. So preferably you would be dealing with a company or an individual who is residing in Canada. So there are Canadian companies and individuals who are, involved in the settlement enterprise. And if you can construct a claim, you can find a plaintiff who has been damaged directly by the wrongdoing of that company or individual, and they reside in Canada, your chances of getting the Canadian court to hear it will go up. So you want the case to be as Canadian-centric as possible.
If I can add to what Dimitri has said, and address two things which I see have come up in the questions. First is that, yes, in 1998, the Rome Statute, which was adopted by a majority of countries in the world, created the International Criminal Court. And 4 years later, in 2002, that became officially part of international law. In 2000, Canada became, I believe, the very first country in the world to domesticate the 1998 Rome Statute into Canadian law through the Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act. And in the definition of war crimes is that the creation of civilian settlements by an occupying power and occupied territory is a war crime. It's very clear definition, and it was one of the reasons why the United States did not sign and ratify the Rome Statute, and it's the lead reason why Israel did not sign the Rome Statute. So it's in Canadian law that the Israeli settlements are a war crime, in addition to being a grave breach under the 1977 additional protocols to the Fourth Geneva Convention. So fast forward to 2018 and 2019, when there are debates and discussions around the renewal of the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement. And I appeared before the Senate committee together with the Secretary General of Amnesty International Canada with respect to that aspect of the CIFTA agreement, the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement, which allowed settlement goods being produced in Israel to be able to enter into Canada tariff-free as part of the agreement, the new free trade agreement. The Canadian agreement, and the Canadian government did this with their eyes wide open, treated the settlements as part of Israel under the customs agreement that had been created in the aftermath of the Oslo agreements. Despite arguments being made to it that settlements are war crimes under both international and Canadian law, and the fact that the settlements they're not part of Israel and can be excluded from it, the Canadian government and the Senate went on to adopt the free trade agreement, ratify the legislation, enabling legislation, and put it into law. That is I think a stain on Canada's reputation with respect to this, and is something I hope through probably the devoted activities of civil society will be something that in Canada, the Canadian government will be forced to rectify in the future. Thanks.
Thanks so much. I think we have time for one more question. For all the panelists, perhaps Leah can start, I don't know, or Rehab if she comes back. One of our audience members writes, to my mind, the two-state solution is dead. We need to move to a process somewhat like happened in South Africa, where there will be equality and justice for all. There needs to be strong leadership for the Palestinian people. Why isn't there a stronger movement towards a one-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian issue?
Is Rehab back?
Rehab is back, yes. We see Rehab. Maybe Rehab would be the logical place to start with you, but others may have comments to add. Unmute Rehab.
Keep doing this. I keep doing this. At this point, Palestinians care about equality. They suffer from the segregation and apartheid system, the tens of Israeli laws that discriminate against Palestinians. So when we say equality for all people in this land, it doesn't matter that it leads to two states or one state for all its citizens, regardless of their religion or color or ethnicity. However, at this point, a one democratic state, we can't see it coming. We have the most racist Israeli population we ever experienced. The settlers, the education they received, they behave in such impunity, of course, armed with their machine guns. I don't see it, I'll say simply. I don't see a one state coming. However, we can fight at least for equality and for abolishing these laws of discrimination at this point. Leah.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think, in 2011, I went to South Africa to show a project I had made back then and to screen it. And I went to a number of different places and studied the transition post-apartheid there. And all I have to say is, if we end up like that, God help us. The situation in South Africa is significantly worse than it's been even pre-apartheid in terms of the distribution of resources, and in the possibility for advancement, social mobility, and any other marker of life and quality of life. What I witnessed in South Africa was atrocious. And while on paper it's true that the official segregation between the blacks and the whites is over, the white population, which is 16% of the population, is in control of almost 70% of the economy. The poverty is all black, the wealth is all white. The differences are stark. And the inequalities, while not so on paper, are remarkable. And God help us if that's where we end up. I don't think that as Canadians, it is your place or really your most effective thing you can do to debate whether we should end up in a 1 or 2 state solution. I think that the best use of Canadian energy is to disengage Canadian support for one of the parties. The Canadian Free Trade Agreement, which was mentioned, business alliances, the training by the Israeli army of the Canadian forces, the Canadian-Israel arms trade, which is enormous, and all of the ways in which the Canadian government has involved itself to the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars in supporting the Israeli government. Disengaging that should be the role of Canadians, and figuring out how to get Canada's hands out of the bloody situation that exists there, and then we can talk about 1 or 2 state solutions.
Thank you so much, both of you. Dimitri or Michael, you don't have to comment on that, but if you had a real quick comment, we'd take that before wrapping. And I'll note that the case about Belin that was mentioned has been shared to all attendees. Again, Ali, thank you for sharing that information.
Briefly, David, I would add this. I agree with everything Leah said. I've been to South Africa, and to my mind, based on what I saw, apartheid is very much alive in South Africa. I agree also that it's not the place of persons who are neither Palestinian nor Israeli to offer to militate for one solution or the other. Ultimately, that is something that will have to be determined by them. The only thing I would perhaps part company with Leah on is that I don't think that what has happened in South Africa is inevitable. It's horrible what's happened. I don't think we really understand how deeply entrenched apartheid remains in that country. But I'm a little bit, maybe Leah feels the same way because she didn't talk about the top possibilities, but I do feel that there is the potential, if people have the political will to actually create a single state in which there is true equality. I think it can happen. It didn't happen in South Africa, and I have no illusions about how difficult that will be in Israel and Palestine.
Thank you very much. And I apologize to all the great questioners who've asked questions we're not able to answer. It is true that part of this panel did address the UN and international law. That is only part of the picture. There are things we can do, as Leah said, to disengage or push for the disengagement of Canadian support for the occupying power here. The petitions that have been distributed, engaging in Canadian political action to call out our elites, call out the political parties that are supporting this. The governing parties we've had all seem to support the occupation in one way or another. So there are political actions we can take here to reduce the power of the occupying party. I wanted to conclude first by thanking our panelists, thanking everybody attend, but thanking Rehab, Dimitri, Leah, and Michael for your different perspectives on this issue, and for the different ways forward that you've offered us to consider as things that we can engage with as Canadians, people residing in Canada, or people elsewhere who are interested in this. There will be a video coming out of this. It's already on Facebook and on YouTube. We'll probably send that link to everybody who registered. A bunch of people registered weren't able to attend. That's pretty normal, but we will share it widely. We wanted to conclude with a bit of tape from a video of an interview that Dimitri did in his previous role as a journalist. He's on a hiatus as journalist now while he runs for leadership of the Green Party. But he did some very fine journalism with the Real News Network, a great independent news source that Leah also worked for. Particularly, I mean, there's lots of stuff if you look on the Real News Network of Dimitri's work, but particularly I'm referring to 2 years ago during the Freedom Flotilla's campaign for a just future for Palestine. We continue to sail against the blockade of Gaza. That's where we've chosen to focus on that particular war crime, that particular collective punishment of millions of people in Gaza, half of whom, so over 1 million of whom, are children who are completely innocent. I mean, all of the civilians are innocent. The children and young people are particularly innocent. So we focus on the war crime of the blockade and the denial of freedom of movement for Palestinians in Gaza. But as we recently heard, and we'll bring the video to you soon, Amira Haas has pointed out that the future of the children of the West Bank is the present of the children of Gaza. So if we continue, Canada and the world continues to support this enclavization of little pockets of Palestinians, the kind of isolation that young people and children in Gaza suffer from is the only future that the world will be offering Palestinians everywhere in historic Palestine. So the interview that Dimitri did 2 years ago, he did a bunch of wonderful interviews, and I would encourage you to look at them all on the Real News Network. We will share some of them on our social media. The one that we wanted to conclude with is an interview he did with Heather Milton Lightning, a Canadian Aboriginal youth activist who was on one of the boats to Gaza in 2018. We have that video lined up here, but please also go to the Real News Network and see some of Dimitri's other interviews from the 2018 Freedom Flotilla. He was on several different boats in several different ports, spoke to many interesting people, and follow our work, follow the Canadian Boat to Gaza's work as just another way that we can get around the instances of power that aren't doing anything and direct our attention directly at the war crime being committed against Palestinian civilians in Gaza and throughout Palestine. I think the video is queued up. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you again to our panelists, to all the attendees, the folks watching us on YouTube and Facebook. Stick around afterwards. Some of the links will be shared, and we will be emailing out more information to everybody who registered for the webinar. Thank you so much for attending. Jason, we got the video now? Hopefully.
This community, do you see parallels between the struggles of Indigenous peoples in Canada and the struggle of the Palestinian people? If so, what are they?
So I had the opportunity a couple of years ago to go with a delegation with Interfaith Peace Builders, a group, an organization that sends delegations over about 4 times a year. And so we didn't go into Gaza, but we did go to the West Bank, and they tried really intentionally to have us visit all different facets of Palestinian life, but to also get a better sense of the political climate. And I think the things that really stood out for me on that trip was just seeing the escalated violence, but also the similarities in a lot of different ways. And I think that's the thing that we can relate to, is the settler colonial machinery. And for us, that was Britain and then later Canada. And a lot of the tactics that were used by Canada, by the British Crown, are so similar in terms of, not being able to leave the reservation boundaries without a pass, being the only people in Canada that by race have an identity card, which is very similar to the Palestinian identity card. There's just an ongoing list of things that are super similar. And I think the thing that stands out to me is just the high level escalated violence that Palestinian people have to deal with on a daily basis. And I think we've been in the process of dealing with this colonial machinery for a very long time, and it's stretched over a period of time. And I think there's differences in the way violence plays out in our communities, but also that is in the ways that it's inflicted by the state. And I think the thing that I really appreciate is the resilience of the Palestinian people. And I think, really understanding in my home territory, there's Palestinian families that are exiled that live there. I had the opportunity to go to Standing Rock and to support the actions that were happening there against the Dakota Access Pipeline. And there were numerous Palestinian delegations that came to Standing Rock. And so I think that's the message that we've always kind of told each other, is to show up for each other in solidarity, because we understand that our struggles are they're linked together. And I think the thing that really stood out for me is really understanding how the process happened and really understanding that there's a link with the British Crown, both with Palestine and in Canada in particular, and with a lot of other Indigenous people that were colonized by the British. And so it's really interesting to see how colonial powers have played out both historically, but in present day, and really understanding that, you know, Britain and Canada, the United States, and all of these other countries, Canada in particular, as the Great March happened, and the series of protests happened, and we've seen a lot of people being killed, Canada made public statements, but it hasn't imposed a sanction. It's not going to stop doing business with Israel. It's not going to do any of those things. And so, you know, it'll pat itself on the back for being a good humanitarian publicly on Twitter, you know, all of these different things. But when it comes to taking action and imposing those, we haven't seen that yet. And I think the thing that's linked to that is Canada has 98.8% of our land, and we agreed to share it. And I think that's the thing with colonial powers, is that they have to go through a process of admitting that they stole the land and took it illegally. And I don't think Canada, United States, or Britain, or any of these other colonial powers, including Israel, are going to do that anytime soon. But that doesn't mean that we don't take action to fight back, but also to incrementally take back our rights. And we've seen that in Canada, and we've seen that, of course, with the Palestinian struggle, and also being really global. So I think that's really important to figure out the ways that we can have solidarity, and be strategic about that. And taking action is really important.
Thanks for that. Thank you to all the panelists. Good afternoon, and we will be sending you, everybody who registered, follow-up information in a follow-up email. Thank you all for attending. Please follow the work of the Canadian Boat to Gaza and the Freedom Flotilla.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Oh, the song we're hearing, the Women's Boat to Gaza.
We anchored up and sailed out from the shore of Spain. Our boat Zaytuna, Olive is her name. And Olive is the symbol of a faraway place to which we steer our course across the waves. We are 13 women here to sail with peace in our hand towards our sisters in this foreign land, to learn from many different corners of this world. We have come to bring to you the freedom of a song. We will sail for your freedom, our sisters in Palestine. We will never be silent until you are free. We are guided by the lights of the stars at night, and the power of the sea so very bright. As the world is watching us, we bring our women's voice with a message that we all should have a choice. Your grandmothers, they planted olive trees upon the land where you should live in peace. Those trees of 1,000 years, they have been dug away. May daughters plant new seeds and to let them stay. We will say for your freedom, our sisters in Palestine. We will never be silent until you are